I'm your host, Dennis Horvitz, the David Letterman of the Hopelessly Damned. We're doing another in our series of shows done from the 36th Annual American Atheist Convention. I've been spending the last 2 days conscripting speakers at the convention, and my latest victim, actually this is kind of a long time in coming, is Cecil Bothwell. Thank you for joining us.
Pleased to be here.
Cecil is a member of the City Council of Asheville, North Carolina, and I'll get to that in a second, but he is also the author of this book, Whale Falls, holding that up right there. In any case, we will... he's not just any city council member. Cecil is an outspoken atheist. And you've gotten yourself, I guess, into a little bit of hot water. But before we get into that, now, when you ran for office, did you run as an outspoken atheist?
No, I really didn't. I tend to believe that our religious beliefs have no bearing whatsoever on our politics and ought not to really be involved. Therefore, I didn't stress the fact that I was an atheist. I ignored the fact that I was an atheist. And I think my opponents, not directly the people I was running against, but people who opposed my election, pretty much ignored it as well, right up until I won the primary. I was in a 10-way race for 3 seats on our city council, and in the primary race, I came in first. I don't think they thought I had a chance because they probably assumed that a city in the Deep South would not elect an atheist, and I guess they assumed people knew. Then it became an issue. Between the primary and the general election, they ran a smear campaign against me, 2 direct mail campaigns, apparently targeted, as far as we can tell, at voters 50 and older, probably guessing that they were likely to be a more religious crowd on average than maybe the whole electorate. And they pasted me with all sorts of things. They claimed that I was godless, heathen, socialist, communist, and of course an atheist. And in fact, I finished 3rd in the general election of 3 seats, so I still won a seat on council. But I think that their campaign probably had some effect on the electorate. How
many seats are there, just out of curiosity, on the Asheville City Council altogether?
There are 7 seats, including the mayor, and we have a weak mayor system, so it's not a particularly stronger seat. It's one more vote. Sort of leads the parade, but.
First amongst equals, is that the...
That sort of thing, yeah.
Not unlike the Pope? No, I think...
Our mayor sets the agenda, but the agenda is set based on the advice and consent of the rest of the council members. And to give you an example, Asheville is a very liberal southern city. There's no question about it. Although our mayor is a very strict Southern Baptist, I don't know if I have her particular church right, but she's a Baptist for sure. She's an African-American woman, and that's fairly unusual in the South. So, I mean, that's indicative of being a fairly liberal city as well.
Right. So basically, you wound up being elected, much to apparently the shock and dismay of many people.
Right.
So tell us what happened. You're elected. It's time to be sworn in.
Well, of course, these opponents were shocked and amazed, and then one of them noticed, a lawyer, in fact, noticed that in the North Carolina Constitution there is a provision, it's an archaic provision, but it's still there, which says that no one can hold office in North Carolina who shall deny the being of Almighty God. Well, he looked at the acknowledgments in the back of my biography of Billy Graham, where I had mentioned that I didn't believe in supernatural beings of any stripe, and decided that that was denying the being of Almighty God.
Let me just interrupt. By the way, I forgot to mention that he is also the author of a book, The Prince of War, which is about Billy Graham.
Right.
And maybe we'll get to that in a little bit, a little later. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a political biography, as we can talk about in a bit. Anyway, this fellow who took exception, this lawyer, is the head of the Sons of the Confederacy in North Carolina, which is a white supremacist group pretty much known to have ties to the KKK, although no ties to the KKK are above, are obvious or open. They don't believe that the South lost the Civil War and don't believe that the federal government has any right to impose rules.
Right.
Well, he raised the issue, but then he handed it off to the fellow who brought the issue. And he's a gentleman named H.K. Edgerton, who's a well-known eccentric in our community. He is an African-American gentleman who was head of the NAACP chapter in our region and was drummed out apparently or allegedly due to financial hijinks. I don't really know what happened there. But when he left the NAACP, he joined the Sons of the Confederacy and now parades around our town in a Confederate uniform carrying the stars and bars.
That's messed up.
And he insists that slavery was a benign institution, a partnership between blacks and whites that was messed up by the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. So
King Kong Fay Ray went to the top of the Empire State Building with King Kong because she wanted a good view of New Jersey.
That's the deal.
Yeah.
And so, his father was a minister, he said, and in respect of his father, he had to prevent me from being seated on city council.
Wow. That is screwed up on so many levels. It's hard to even imagine.
Of course, that's unenforceable under the U.S. Constitution.
Yes, I was going to get that. So basically, it's generally the states under the Constitution have powers which are not reserved by the federal government. Any powers that the federal government reserves do not reserve to itself. They're fault of the states and the local community. But if it's a federal law to prohibiting the holding of religious tests of any kind, then it doesn't matter what kind of laws a state practices, the various states and Commonwealth.
Right.
It's simply not legal. The fact that it's on the books doesn't make it legal.
Right. And so then when I was sworn into office, I took the official oath, and as it happens, despite that God clause in our Constitution, the Constitution also provides for oaths of office for either theists or non-theists, and you're allowed under our Constitution to affirm, which I had done previously as a jury in a jury duty situation.
Same here as in New York.
Yeah,
as well.
And so that further inflamed people when they discovered that I was going to affirm. And I was tempted. A friend of mine gave me a hardbound copy of The Origin of Species, and I was tempted to get sworn in with my hand on that. But the truth is, I don't hold that book to be holy. It's just it was very good scientific information for its period.
But it would have been making a point.
But it would have been making a point.
Yeah. Let me ask you something about and this is again, this is your opinion. If you had been a religious person who was affirming on religious grounds as opposed to secular reasons, do you think that you would have gotten any flack at all for affirming?
Probably not, because I mean, for instance, Quakers who are theists in a different fashion than Christians will not swear to God or on the Bible or anything, So it's not simply the non-theists who feel that way. And I think had the whole issue not been brought to a head, none of that would have occurred. So consequent to that, Mr. Edgerton threatened to do a citizen's arrest of all of the other council members for doing business with me. And that hasn't occurred yet, but I'm kind of anticipating that he'll show up at a city council meeting with a long piece of rope and try to tie up the rest of the council at some point.
Oh, wow. Well, I'd love to be there with our camera. I just love to see that. So how does it stand now? You have been you've been affirmed in.
I've been affirmed in.
And you're an active member of the city council.
Absolutely.
Have you found that your atheist status has it interfered with your participating or conducting business?
No, I would say there's no way in which it interferes with business. It does appear on the blogs and the comments sections of newspaper websites and all. It's drug up from time to time, and I assume it will be as long as I'm on council. Every time I make a vote that particular faction disagrees with, they'll probably want to remind everyone. Another oddment in throughout the South, and maybe in many places in the country, is that public meetings are often opened with a prayer. Recently in Forsyth County, North Carolina, a county lost a lawsuit over that issue. They were having a prayer at the beginning of each county commission meeting, and it was almost always a specifically Christian prayer. And that was taken to court, and they lost a good bit of money. There was a financial settlement involved, which brought a warning to all municipalities in North Carolina that we must comply. In the city government, that had been brought to a head 6 or 8 years ago when ministers were coming and doing a prayer at the beginning of each meeting, and they changed it to where each council person in turn can say a few minutes of something at the beginning. Typically, that has been a Christian prayer. But now, in this election, a Jewish woman was elected, and I'm there, and so we're still rotating at this point until that gets cast aside. And there's some question whether that's even legal at this point, because again, it's prone to be a Christian prayer, which excludes so many others. But I quote from when it's my turn, a section from Darwin or Einstein, or I used one prayer from a Unitarian minister, who's my minister. I'm a member of Unitarian Church, a very atheist congregation. Our minister is an atheist, and so there are words of inspiration about the love we should share in a community, the work we're doing together. And interestingly, the Jewish woman who was elected, when it was her turn first, she started out by saying, at the beginning of these meetings, we always have everybody close their eyes and listen to some thoughts. I want you to open your eyes and look around the room. These are the people in your community. These are the people we want to work with. We're here to do the best we can for all of us. It was it surprised a lot of people, because everybody else was always, ducking their heads. I also refuse to say under God. We open each meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance, and I can't. We're one nation under law. We're one nation under the Constitution. We are not one nation under God. It's like injecting a fantasy into a pledge of allegiance to our nation. And I even have some difficulty with nationalism, but that's a separate issue.
Right. Well, but the thing is, when you have issues like under God with the Pledge of Allegiance, part of the problem is that I think the vast majority of people who want the phrase "under God" kept in the Pledge of Allegiance don't really see what the problem is. It's because it doesn't address a specific God. But the Supreme Court interpreted the Establishment Clause to meaning the favoring. You can't favor religion over non-religion, in addition to not favoring a particular religion over other religions. But I think there's such a thing as legal precedent, and unfortunately, these prayers have been there since day one of the Republic, and it's just legal precedent. Carries weight.
Certainly does.
And in law, regardless of whether it makes sense logically, the fact that something has been done for a while, in many cases, is legal. It makes it legal enough to keep it in there, even though it may be antithetical to what was said in the Constitution.
Although, of course, the "under God" added to the Pledge of Allegiance was added during the McCarthy era, during the red baiting and witch hunting that was going on then. And
1954.
Yeah, and I don't really know. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know what the legal requirement there is.
Right. Well, is it? I'm sure you've. I don't know if you. I don't know if you've met him, but he's been a guest on this show several times. Michael Newdow, who's the lawyer, the attorney, operating room physician, who brought the case in California several years ago to remove "under God" from the Pledge of Allegiance, and I actually saw him at a separate lecture. And he said one of the reasons, for instance, we have prayers opening legislative sessions, the fact that we have that most states, if not cities, have a legislative pastor of some kind, is because these were already in place during the colonies, and when we became a separate nation, that basically these clergy people were kind of grandfathered in, and having been established there is like what politician's going to put their put their butt on the line to get rid of a clergy person, you know, from the state or federal government, basically.
Yeah, because being such a strong voting bloc, also for legislators to take the initiative to remove something like that becomes an extremely hot button issue.
It's suicide, basically.
Yeah.
It's suicide. So yeah, you've had the situation where you, of course, I mean, you're also legally entitled to not say under God, but that's kind of like not the point. It shouldn't be in there in the first place. And it's just once these things are established, it's very difficult. And but I think that not just in your case, but just generally around the country, clearly the Constitution is being violated with impunity.
Absolutely.
And I think the reason they get away with that is because people either don't know or don't care, or they think the government should enforce a religious agenda. And I think if people were alert and up in arms and really concerned about the Constitution, I don't think these politicians would be sitting there and looking the other way or actively encouraging religious statements made by the government. I don't think. I think President Obama is very much soft-pedaled it on the National Day of Prayer. I got the feeling during the presidential campaign that both McCain and Obama would rather have not gone there anyway. And I was not a fan of McCain, but
an interesting point about that is that up until the early 1950s, there were never any religious ceremonies held at the U.S. Capitol. The separation was actually pretty intact. Yeah. There was a chaplain, and I guess still is a chaplain in Congress and that sort of thing. But as far as actually having religious services there, it never happened. Billy Graham, as it turned out, one of the things I learned in doing my work on him.
Great segue, by the way. I was going right.
He got his friends in Congress through. He had strong oil interests who were supporting his crusades, who also gave money to congressional campaigns. He got Congress to pass a bill to permit him to hold the first crusade on the steps of the Capitol. During Truman's period of time, he was before 1952. It was maybe 51. He got permission to hold a thing, and he broke the previous separation. He led the way on that. And since then, he, of course, created the National Prayer Breakfasts and continued to intrude religion into the White House at every opportunity. One of the things I learned, in researching his history, he has often claimed in his writing, through his speeches and so forth, that he's called to the White House when the presidents have needed spiritual advice. Well, there's two problems with that. One is he invited himself over and over and over again. He intruded himself. Mostly he was an unwelcome interference until he had a large enough voting bloc that he was of interest. And then he was of interest during election years.
Right. And you say in your book that Truman was less than thrilled.
Yeah, of all the presidents, Truman probably had the lowest opinion of him. He called him a charlatan to other people, not to his face. He had a very bad impression of him. Kennedy didn't have much of a relationship because Billy Graham started the anti-Catholic movement to keep a Catholic out of the White House. He held a meeting in Switzerland, and with Norman Vincent Peale, with his father-in-law, who was an active Christian missionary, and many other religious leaders, and they came back to the United States and fomented the anti-Catholicism that came close to costing Jack Kennedy the election. Right. Although he made a very strong case, he had the opportunity to go on TV and say that that his religion was private, and he turned out to be one of the more secular presidents in regard to the presidency.
Yeah.
But Graham kept on. Little tidbits I picked up along the way, and what I found mostly was his political advice to the presidents, and that's what my book's about. It's a political biography. I don't much take exception to his beliefs, people are entitled to believe
Sure.
what they will.
Right.
But,
can I just
yeah.
interrupt? And I forgot to mention at the beginning of the show that, but you actually, you have a huge body of work as a reporter. I mean,
Yes.
that was your chosen trade? Isn't
Yeah,
that right?
I've won regional and national awards from professional journalists as an investigative reporter and commentator, critical writer, and so I've got that track record. I wasn't just out of the blue writing a biography about Graham.
Right, and you've
Question, Dennis.
Yeah.
When you talk about the Nixon tapes with Billy Graham, I think that's very important.
Oh yes, yeah, I was coming to that. Okay, yeah.
Okay, well, what got me into the Billy Graham story was in March of 2002, one of those infamous Nixon White House tapes had been released, and a transcript got to the Associated Press, and I read a story in the paper, a couple of paragraphs, that it was about the Jews. Billy Graham was denigrating the Jews, talking about the satanic Jews who were wrecking the United States, that he couldn't let them know how he felt because some of them thought he was their friend. He referred to the New York Jews, probably referring to the Sulzberger at the New York Times and so forth. He very ominously said to Nixon, this was not long before the 1972 election, which for you who are young enough to not know that history, that was after the Watergate break-in,
right,
but before the Watergate break-in became a problem for Nixon. He said to Nixon, maybe we can do something about it after the election. So he wanted to do something about the Jews that were wrecking this country. I think Watergate probably interrupted his plans there. But I had been an investigative reporter for about 15 years at that point.
Okay, and who were you working for at the time?
I was writing principally through Alternet, the national, international news service, syndication service, and for the Mountain Express newspaper in Asheville, North Carolina, where I was at that time managing editor of the paper. I knew that a two-paragraph AP story in a local paper was not the story. It was a piece of the story. It was what they had space to print.
Sure.
And particularly in his hometown paper, they were not going to print a long story, a long negative. Well, he apologized to the Jews. He apologized to the National Association of Rabbis. It all quieted down.
Right.
I went for the transcript. I got the original the transcript and the tape, listened to it. It turned out that the conversation wasn't a brief conversation. It was over an hour and a half long. Graham was running down the Jews at length, and he was leading the conversation at many points. It wasn't just saying, yes, Mr. President, yes, which many people would do. He was the source of this.
And it wasn't a toss-off either. It wasn't
right,
just,
yeah. And so that made me think, well, okay, that all I'd ever really heard about him, I mean, I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to Graham, was that he gave spiritual advice to the presidents and he had crusades. I thought, what other conversations has he had with presidents? And so I started digging. I started from the Nixon archives in Washington. They were in Washington at the time. They're now at the Nixon Library. And then spread backward and forward to the other presidencies. And I discovered that as far back as under Harry Truman, he advocated for war with Korea before the Korean War was an issue. It wasn't. I mean, there were troubles over there, but he told Truman there were more Christians per capita in Korea than anywhere else in the country, and excuse me, in the world, anywhere else in the world, which was not then true and is not now and has never been true. Right. Truman didn't like Graham and ignored him. He tried to get Eisenhower to get involved in French Indochina, which we know better as Vietnam. Eisenhower meddled in Indochina with the leadership there, but he wouldn't invade. However, he got a more sympathetic ear under Johnson. Again, as I said, Kennedy, and Kennedy's presidency was fairly abbreviated, but there wasn't much love lost between he and Kennedy. But under Johnson, he got a warm handshake. He used to go skinny dipping with Lyndon Johnson in the White House pool. That was
how he liked to do business.
Johnson liked to do business that way, yeah. He apparently was very proud of himself, his body, and he liked to show off. Anyway, he went to Vietnam a few times for Johnson to rally the troops. And when Johnson started the carpet bombing of North Vietnam, B-52s were bombing every square foot. They were trying to destroy everything in some areas of Vietnam. The code name was Rolling Thunder, taken from Billy Graham's Crusade, his theme song for his crusade. Probably the most heinous thing I came upon was that under Nixon's presidency, Graham advocated for genocide. He urged Nixon to bomb the dikes in North Vietnam, which would, by military estimates, have killed upward of 1 million people. Because when you bomb dams in a water-type country, the water floods down and wipes out everything below that.
Right.
We hung Germans after World War II for bombing dikes. I mean, it's a war crime. It's a high crime. Well, Nixon...
And Hitler, and I think Hitler, in the closing days of World War II, Hitler actually ordered that something similar, I think it wasn't dikes, I guess it was a sewer system in Berlin, where he knew people were hiding from the bombs, just opened up and killed. Of course, his people refused to.
Yeah.
He never knew that, but yeah, that would be a war crime for sure.
Yeah. Nixon declined, but when he declined, a few months later, Graham carried that same plan to Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor, and to Melvin Laird, the Defense Secretary, attempting to push that plan forward. So the name of my book became The Prince of War, both as a play on the Prince of Peace, which is, you know, and also because I believe that's what Billy Graham has been as a politician. He advocated, another weird one was the week before the first Gulf War, this is according to George H.W. Bush, the senior Bush. In his White House diary, he reported that Graham called him that week before the first Gulf War and told him that Saddam was the Antichrist, and it was his historic mission to destroy him. Wow. So it's been very strange advice he's given to presidents.
Just before we run out of time, I just want to mention that the two books are, as you just talked about, The Prince of War and Whale Falls. We didn't really have a chance to get into this. Could you just really quickly...
I can give you a quick one. The subtitle of Whale Falls is An Exploration of Belief and Its Consequences. It's a book I started before I ran for office, and then I was interrupted by running for city council for 10 months, and then finished it more since then, since November. It's a discussion of how our beliefs affect our choices in our lives, in our diet, in our relationship with the world, in our politics, how it's affected my life, and to help people reflect on how their beliefs reflect into what they do and think about the world.
Well, in any case, thank you very much for joining us. Thank
you for having me here.
Tried to set this up months ago. We have been taping from the 36th Annual American Atheist Convention. I have been your host, Dennis Horvitz. Thanks for watching. See you next week.